friends. Welcome back to another episode of the Adventures in Advising podcast. And as always, my name is Matt Markin, and I am thrilled that you're listening today. And if you don't already subscribe to this podcast on your favorite podcast platform, and I know you're on social media, so give us a follow as well. You'll find us at Advising Podcast on most social media platforms. So, all right, with that done, let's get into this episode. And I am excited that Dr. Melinda Anderson is back with us. Melinda, when you're coming back to California?
Right, as soon as I can. It's so good to see you, Matt. I missed you so much, and thank you so much. I'm really excited to be back here with you today and to have this shared conversation.
Yeah, last time you were on was back in January, and now it's June, so got to make sure that you're on more often.
Yes, absolutely. I really do enjoy not just our dialogue, but when we have guests on and you let me co-host, and so that's always very exciting to kind of hear what's going on in the field.
Yeah, and I know this episode we're going to talk about all things student success, including academic warning and probation. But first off, I want to congratulate you on your new role at Achieving the Dream. Can you talk about that a little bit more?
Yes, absolutely. I'm very excited. The last time we talked, I think it was probably in the sense of, hey, I'm, stepping away from NACADA. And so I had an opportunity to join Achieving the Dream a couple months later. And Achieving the Dream, it's a wonderful network organization focusing on community colleges. So we have 300 plus community colleges in our network. In 45 states, and 1/3 actually of the population is in rural spaces. And so when I think about the work in terms of access and affordability and social mobility, what I love about ATD in terms of their work is really, centering equity around student success issues and initiatives. And so looking at how do we help institutions transform in all aspects, right, in all areas, and thinking about how are we centering student success on equity points. And so I would just really enjoy coming into that work. So my position here is as executive director for network engagement. And so I know people are like, what does that mean, Melinda? And so what does that mean is I have an opportunity to support programming and services around welcoming institutions into our network. But then I also have in my portfolio focusing on tribal colleges and universities. And so just really excited to be a part of that work. That I've worked at an HBCU. And so when I think about similarities around just how they're formed in terms of community and support, so learning more about tribal colleges and universities as I go. So very excited about that work. And then other aspects of my portfolio include rural rural institutions. And so thinking about strategically, how are we supporting rural institutions? Because oftentimes many of them are economic engines within their communities. And so when we think about, impacts of the pandemic, now we're thinking about, conversations around diversity and equity and inclusion. So what does that work look like in many of these spaces? So very excited to be here and a part of this work.
Just continuing to work and always busy.
always, Mark, busy.
So I'm glad you're able to find time for this. I'm glad it worked out. And, if we're adding to your plate, you most recently also, at least for me, you presented to a lot of the advisors at the institution I work at. So to kind of give listeners a little context, our university went to a centralized advising model. And one of the, new responsibilities for our advisors is to meet with students on academic probation or academic warning. And so a lot of our advisors didn't necessarily have a lot of foundation in that. They definitely meet with students and probably have those conversations and don't know they are. But this is kind of the more formal responsibility that they were given. And we couldn't think of anyone better to talk with our advisors as one of our presenters than you. So thank you again for presenting.
No, you're welcome. And I just have to give my hat and kudos to you and your group of just the training experience overall, when you kind of shared with me, each step that you're going to have in terms of a systematic approach to the way that you were supporting them and taking on this new role, which, oftentimes we don't do as institutions, right? Like, it's kind of do as I say, not as I do, right? But you guys are really walking the walk and saying, okay, if this is a new service role, then how are we helping to support around professional development opportunities? And so, I just thank you again for giving me an opportunity to be a part of that event. Because the reality, in terms of not just degree attainment, right, but the idea that social mobility is often tied to degree attainment. And so when students sometimes hit an academic hiccup, right, and they're transitioning in different ways, there are some skills, right, as advisors that we need in order to make sure that we're supporting each and every student, but then especially thinking about how do we attune ourselves to those who are going through these academic transitions, just not just around motivation, right, but just understanding fit academically and tied to what it is that they're trying to achieve. So it was a good time.
Yeah, and I think connected to that, during your presentation, one of the first things you shared was a quote from Terrell Strayhorn about, and for you, is about academic advisors acting as cultural navigators. Why was that important to you to start off informing us about that?
Right. No, I really love that question, Matt, because I love using his language. He presented at a NACADA conference when we were in Minnesota, and I promise you, I was looking for Prince the whole time I was there. No, I'm kidding. But what I loved about his presentation was just that reality that advisors are sometimes beyond faculty, right? That one person that is dedicated to supporting you and being very intentional on how you're experiencing the institution. And so when I talk to advisors, we always know that there's some students that are like, well, the university ... right? But we also know it's like, well, who did you talk to? And what department was that? And who was the person in the department you talked to? But the reality is around cultural navigation, when we think about, and I, joke about, the bureaucracy of higher education, but, the truth of the matter is that every institution, which is of people, right? Every institution is its people, but there's always a culture there. How do students know what to do, when to do it? What does that look like here? So even if you're transferring, right, or if you're a first year start at that institution, leadership changes, policies change, then procedures change, and then practices change. And so how do we help to continue to think about our practices in the field in a way that is consistently supporting students and getting them to where they need to be? And so he coins that phrase, that sentiment perfectly by saying that we're cultural navigators. We really are.
And, kind of with that, a lot of our students that might find themselves on some sort of academic probation, warning, dismissal, it could be for any number of reasons. You had also talked about with students, and when we're talking with them, it's really making sure that we're looking at it from like a growth mindset. And you had talked about kind of those differences between a growth mindset and a fixed mindset, even whether that might be how a student looks at it or even as an advisor looks at it.
Absolutely. I love that talk, so Carol Dweck, has become very, I would say, I don't know, how the origins of fixed or growth mindset started, unfortunately, just off the top of my head. But when I think about like her work has become famous, right, for this idea of, fixed means X and growth means Y. And so I think it is important for us to think about when we say fixed mindset, the way that we think about when we're approaching a problem or a challenge, what does that actually look like in terms of when we say the differences between both? So the student that says math is hard, I've never been good in math, versus somebody saying, I haven't been good in math, but I feel like this time moving forward, I will be successful. And this is why. These are the things I'm going to adapt to become different in terms of how I approach something that has normally challenged me in the past. And so I think about it from an advising perspective. When we're hearing students, say, hey, maybe it was the professor, or that their teaching style doesn't match my learning style. That was my favorite one, right? Well, why is that? What are some things that you think you can do differently? How do you think about the way that you approach problems, right? From if they're giving you answers that are fixed, and then how do we as advisors transition them to be thinking about them as growth mindset? So I always feel like that's an important way for us to think about how we frame conversations with our students.
And so I'm going to bring up so if you're watching on YouTube, I have an image here that Melinda had shared. and then I'll include it in the show notes, listening to the audio version of the podcast. But it kind of has a breakdown of one side being the fixed mindset, one side being the growth mindset. Now, on the fixed mindset side, one of them says receive criticism or feedback. And there could be some advisors that are saying, when I meet with a student and I try to give them the information, or I try to dig deeper into why maybe they didn't get a higher grade in a class, or whatever it might be, it seems like they're talking to a wall. Do you have any advice for an advisor if they're working with a student that might maybe be like that?
Right. I do have some advice. I can give some guidance on how I approach it.
Yeah.
I always tell, students and, staff and colleagues, look, I am not a psychologist or a psychiatrist or a counselor, right? A mental health counselor by any means, right? I only play one on TV, right? But when I think about having this kind of conversation, a student says, I want to major in biology and I want to go to medical school, but I don't like, certain aspects of the curriculum, right? So like, I don't want to take calculus, or I don't want to do fill in the blank class. And so really just trying to tie them into saying, do they understand how critically important it is for them to embrace the challenges that are coming forward, because that's what makes a difference. So the example I think that I gave in the session was that, I worked with some nursing students when I was in a former role, and some of them were a little hesitant about taking statistics, just concerned about, how comfortable they felt, in a math course. And I mentioned to them, if you were being taken care of by a nurse practitioner, a nurse, somebody with a clinical background, you would want them to know how to calculate, formulas around what type of medicines you need. Sometimes you have to do, some formulas around, okay, if a patient weighs this much, how much medicine should they receive? Things of that nature. I'm speaking in generality. So, I'm just trying to protect you, Matt. So somebody's like, that's not what nurses do. But, the reality is that you would want somebody in that space to feel comfortable with that knowledge, right? And so sometimes we might tell ourselves that we can't do it. It's not something that we want to face. But when you think of the larger goal of what you're trying to achieve, then yes, you would want somebody to feel informed and to feel comfortable and confident in that work. And so helping them see the bigger picture, things that, may seem really big right now, when you think about how it shows up long term, it's like, yeah, I would totally want somebody to feel comfortable being able to do those calculations in order to make sure that I continue to be well. And so then it's like, oh, I get it. Okay, I see. I need to go into this experience understanding how this is going to help me become a better professional or to be successful in my major, right? So that was just like one example in terms of how I would kind of turn the situation around from fixed to growth, kind of playing into the idea of like career pursuits as they move forward earlier. And then, I think overall, just confidence levels, I think from an academic perspective, there might be things that we've experienced as academics or as students, scholars, or, fill in the blank. And so how do we, if we felt like we were knocked down before, how do we grow confidence, right, in our advisees when they're experiencing that again? And so I think of, for example, like adult learners coming back to school, knowing that they need the degree, knowing that they need to be successful, whether it's social mobility, whether it is, I've always wanted to pursue this dream that I've had. And this is kind of reminding them about the goal that they have ahead and saying, you're here for a reason. What are some ways that we can kind of move around these obstacles so, you don't defeat yourself before you even get started.
And of course, one of those obstacles could just be them feeling like, oh my goodness, I'm on this thing called academic probation.
Right.
And so they may get that email or that phone call and it's like, you're on probation. You need to meet with us. What does that mean? Oh my gosh, am I going to get dismissed? Am I in trouble? Am I not good enough? So, when they meet with the advisor, they might have all these kind of preconceived notions and feelings of what it is. What do you feel the role is of an advisor when they first meet with a student who might be listed as a student that's on some sort of probation or warning?
Right. Well, definitely I encourage all advisors to think about, for example, When a student is showing up into that space, number one, you're right, the feeling of, do I not belong here? Am I ever going to be successful? Like I mentioned earlier, confidence issues.
Mm.
Is this a sign that's telling me, right, that I'm moving in the wrong direction? And so I think trying to understand how that student is kind of coming into that experience helps us mirror hope and helps us think through, how do I help build up confidence in this situation? So I think about, for example, if I was in this student's shoes, right, what are the things that I would want my advisor to hear that are going to breed, encouragement and support? But I also think that sometimes institutions, right, like the idea of like probation and warning, like our language, right, even our language. And I'm not saying that calling an apple a banana doesn't make it an apple, right? I'm not saying that. What I'm saying is that if we're framing things like, okay, so you're experiencing some challenges, you are having some academic transitional issues into this space, and just thinking differently about how we're even writing and crafting letters, right? And so I know that many schools, colleagues have mentioned to me that they're even changing like their language of saying academic probation to something else that still gets the point across in terms of the language that they're using, but it doesn't come across as punitive, right? Like you're in a situation because you've experienced some academic difficulty, right? You're having a period of academic transition, and so what we need to do is to talk about what are your next steps. And I think that we think about it from a growth mindset perspective of why is it important for us to have this conversation, because where it is that you're headed, whether that is like, Matt, we know that there's some majors that have GPA requirements that are beyond the idea of just graduating, right? Like this is in your best interest to have a conversation, because you won't be able to graduate in this major with this GPA, right? And then there's even scholarship situations, right? Like your scholarship might have GPA requirements around that. And so sometimes just having these conversations can be empowering in terms of letting a student know what they have control on, but then more importantly around policies, around fit for major or minor, in terms of tying it back. Because I always tell people majors and careers aren't linear, right?
Mhm.
With the exception of like accounting, you know what I mean? And I'm sure that there's others that I won't name, but I think it is important for people to not feel like it's a label or it's an identity of who you are, but it describes what happened, right? It describes what you've experienced in one particular semester, and to treat it like an event, right? And like I said, not to own it in the sense that that's your identity as a student.
Yeah, and I definitely want to come back to the terminology part because I think I have a couple more questions on that. But one thing I do want to ask, and your opinion with your advisor, your experience that working with students is appointment time. I would say most advisors are going to say I have 30 minutes with this student.
Right.
So if this student is on some sort of academic probation warning or notice and they're coming in for that appointment, yes, one, we're trying to address, what happened. We're trying to explain what the policies are. But depending on that student's situation, if something terrible happened and what resources do we offer? Or is it, trying to explain more time management or whatever it might be? I'm trying to squeeze all this information into 30 minutes. But then if I try to maybe do a follow-up, will the student return back for that appointment? What should I go over? Am I trying to get everything in and overwhelm them? Like maybe sometimes student orientation, they might feel that way.
Yes, drinking from a fire hose.
Any advice that you have from your experience working with students?
Right. So, you're absolutely right, Matt. Orientation, we always joke about just like drinking from a fire hose, and you won't remember anything that's going on. And so then the question becomes, how can we offload this information, right? Do we have a Canvas or a Blackboard website where we have the student go through complete documents and they show up to the meeting with the documents and we're all ready to go? And then students show up and they're like, oh, I forgot, and I didn't print it out and I don't have it. And so you're absolutely right about time, because, just like if you were going to a doctor's office, right? You have your general practitioner and then they offer you to a specialist, right? If there's something that, needs closer attention. And I think that you're right. We unfortunately sometimes allot the same amount of time based on the number of students we have, not necessarily what it is, the work that we're doing with that student. And so I do recognize that that's often a challenge that institutions face. In my situation, I worked at a large, R1 institution in Virginia, and so had students on a general caseload around pre-health, right? But you didn't know what was going to come when you're walking into that office, and so oftentimes, working with students who were on probation or academic warning at the time. And for me, I felt like I needed to be, number one, relationship oriented, because you're right. They leave your office, are they, is their heart saddened because of their experience? Do they feel like they're going to give up? And if you don't pay attention or attune yourself to the idea of building a relationship while you're trying to go over all the information, it's critical, right? You may not ever see that student again, especially if they're not required to see you in any way. So the way that I try to break down a 30-minute meeting is, a 5-minute getting to know you, what you're interested in, how to get to know you. The next 10 minutes, of course, is around policies and procedures, because as an advisor, it is critical that we help people understand what is required, right, for you to basically, restore to the institution's policies, or, and be in good academic standing, right? We know that SAP, satisfactory academic progress, you know what I mean, in terms of financial aid. I had served a lot of students that were on financial aid. So it was really critical to make sure I got those policy pieces in. And then the next 5 minutes, I would say, what questions do you have for me? Right. And then the end of the appointment was always, okay, so looking at what you've registered for next semester versus what you need to repeat, how those things work. And then basically, I always want to offer, teach a man to fish is kind of what I do. Mm-hmm. So let's talk about GPA calculation, right? What do you need in order to, for example, depending on what your GPA is, you may need 2 semesters based on what you're planning to take in order to restore that. And so just helping them kind of go through GPA calculations and what that looks like, and then follow up information, and all in an email, right? Because it can be overwhelming. And so you want to be able to go back to something. But what I hope in those 30 minutes is that you built a relationship with the student that says, I care about you. I want you to be successful here. I want you to know what your opportunities are. I want you to know what your options are. But then, also helping them understand that you can do these calculations as well. I'm not the only magic, right, on the scene that can kind of help you with that, although I know it can be confusing. But I'm going to be honest, I agree with you that sometimes 30 minutes isn't enough, and you may not be able to pull that student back in. And so I always try to think of, how do you create, a hierarchy, if you will, about the information that you need to make sure that you get out more so immediately. But I always encourage people to never forget about the relationship building piece, because people don't care how much you know until they know how much you care. And that is just something that I grew up, being raised on and believe heartily. Because even if they don't remember what I said, they'll be like, I remember that she really did care about me, so let me reach back out. But I know that it is a tough thing to manage, especially if you have larger caseloads.
And, we were talking about terminology. I know there's an article from Inside Higher Ed from last year. Then they talked about Cal State Fullerton making that change, going from getting rid of the terminology for probation. And they kind of wanted to do a spin of making it more of a positive change for a negative label. So like, essentially what you've been talking about. And in a way, their hope is that students feel less defeated by getting rid of that term, and not only removing that terminology from anywhere it's written or on the website or the catalog or whatnot, but also that staff and faculty aren't using those terms as well. But there might be some individuals that might think, well, I'm so used to this is how it is. But if we get rid of probation and we call it warning or notice,
right,
will the students actually show up for that appointment, or will they really know what it is, or is it too positive
right term? Right. No, that's actually a brilliant question. I remember reading that article too, and then there was another book that I think I shared with your group, and it was about psychologically attuned language, right, around these concepts of warning and probation. And I think that I even mentioned too that, like, the idea of warning, probation, right, sets up a sense of urgency, right? Like, this is important, warning, right? Probation, right? Like that last step, right? Before your, expulsion kind of thing. And I know that institutions do want at any time to let people know, number one, this is your status at the institution, right? Like these things are critical and they're urgent. So I do agree with you. If you say notice, people might be like, oh, well, thank you for informing me. I really appreciate that, right? But the reality is like, no, there's something going on and you need to do something about that. And so I think that if you are changing language, you're right. It has to be something culturally that, the institutions from faculty, from staff, right, administrators are all thinking differently about the culture that they're trying to create around this idea of like how growth happens in academic transitions, right? Sometimes when you don't meet your academic goals, right, there's a lot of learning that comes from that. And so I think that if you are using language that is, how are you operating differently, right? What are the strategies that you're utilizing differently? Things that kind of speak, like I said, from a growth mindset lens. I think that you can still get urgency across, but it's the language is not as defeatist where you feel like you have no options and you have no place to go. And so it
And
is interesting hearing people talk about how they're changing the language on their campus.
tied to that also is the idea of, do you put a registration hold on a student or not? Of course, there's the for advising, general advising, do you put a hold on them? But I think even in this case, for let's say a student that is on some sort of notice or probation status, the thought is, well, if we put a hold on them, they're more inclined to come in. If we don't, then we think they may not come in. What are your thoughts on that?
Oh, I love this debate because the reality is, for example, we oftentimes put holds on for students for like parking, right? Or library fines or things that are happening in the residence halls, right? Like our idea is like, in order to make this student pay attention, we are going to either lock down registration or, you take away some other service level, right? With a hold. And so sometimes people are just like, no, I just really want the student to come in, and they can't move forward without having a conversation with me. So I understand why, right, holds are used in order to create urgency. Number one, like if you want to register for classes next semester, you need to come in and see me. And then number two, like sometimes students really just don't know, right, until they get ready to register. Then they're like, oh my gosh, I can't. Thank you for letting me know. I don't know how I missed it, and we all know we get 1,000 emails, so it is possible, right? But there's also the reality too, like, are we growing good academic behaviors? I don't want to spend too long here, but for example, when we are an orientation or a freshman seminar, right? The idea that, do you know how to look at your academic record, check your academic history, right? How are you, logging into Canvas and you're taking, checking your grades? How are you thinking about the percentage of totals, right, to your transcript, so that people know, like, okay, so I got an A, but that was a quiz, right? And then I got a C, and that was a midterm, right? So that like the weight of the grades are going to be different, right? What I have found to be, and I wish I had a different answer, but I have seen holds work well in making sure that students are at least talking to somebody to understand what's going on. I think the impact around that is enrollment issues, right? So, for example, well, I can't re-register. I'm already defeated. Something else is already going on in my life, which is what caused me to not do well this academic semester. This is confirmation. I just need to go. So I do struggle with that a little bit in terms of when you have a whole blocking registration. And it seems to always be the carrot, right? Like I remember being in orientation services and being like, okay, you're going to go through the whole day. And then at the end of the day, it's getting your classes, right? And that's the carrot that makes sure that you participate in terms of the entire day. I think it is important that we start building good academic behaviors from the beginning to the end. And relationships are always critical to that. So I think depending on the culture at your institutions, holds may be the best way to grab the attention. However, if you have a campus that's very focused on the relational efforts of working with students, students could enroll, right? But then they're always required to have an appointment with their academic advisor. So you don't need to put the hold on their accounts, right? If you're requiring that they see an academic advisor. So part of me just feels very torn on the issue, to be very honest with you, because in some instances I see that it works very well.
Mhm.
It's also a way to kind of hold the institution accountable of saying, was everybody informed of this information? Nobody's caught off guard. Nobody is surprised by what they're like when they can't register based on a hold. But then I've also seen campuses where it works really well. I'm in touch with my students. I see them all the time. I'm going to have the conversation. And so they are going to be informed. I take notes and I put them in the system so that that information was shared. And so I will have to say, it depends on the culture of your campus, unfortunately. But I have seen both models work very well depending on the school and how they are approaching the way that they're working with students.
No, I definitely agree. I mean, and that's why I was like, I'm going to ask Belinda because I don't think I can give a direct answer to that because
I
I
know.
totally agree with you on that. I think it is something where it really just depends on the institution, the culture. But just like you're saying, if you're building that relationship from the very beginning, then students at least know I know who I can go to. I know I trust this person. Even if I don't remember what the previous appointment we talked about, I know that I got something from that appointment and I can go in and meet with this person and they'll help me out, especially if it's a question I have no idea where to go for it.
Right, right. Yeah, no, I
And
appreciate you asking me, but I know people might have been leaning in like, oh, how's she going to weigh in on that? But like I said, I've worked on several campuses and so I've had that model at some and then I've not had that model at others. And we still did a pretty good job of connecting with our students either way.
absolutely. And you mentioned also in our training and your presentation about 5 things that advisors working with students, no matter if they're on any sort of academic probation or not, but the 5 things you mentioned were, connection, support, being student centered. You also mentioned assessment and heart.
Mm-hmm.
Why those 5 specifically?
Well, when I think about, so for example, I'll start with heart. And so when we talk about the value of higher education, right, how much it costs to get a degree, I think it's just important that we remember our heart in our work, right? This is an individual, not just a number. This is a student, yes, but this could also be a parent, a partner, a spouse. And so when you think about the other roles that students play in their lives, I think it is important for us to remember that our work is making a difference and it's impacting the way people are showing up in the world and for their lives, right? And so I think heart's really important. I think remembering how we build, right, and grow support around students regarding their various challenges, that avocation piece that advisors do very, very well. Is always going to be important to make sure that students understand that they are being heard at various levels of the institutions and we are being responsive. And when I think about assessment, I think it is very powerful for us to say what is working and what is not working, right? So if you're the campus that's like, let's experiment, let's remove holds, right? Did it work? Was it better or worse than what you found before, right? And so assessment, what are the outcomes you're trying to achieve? What are the things that you're going to measure? How are they indirect measures? What are the things that you're going to be paying attention to in order to inform your practices and your policies moving forward? And sorry, Matt, you had 2 others, and I'm trying to remember.
Yeah, so we've covered heart, assessment,
Support.
yeah, support, so student centered and connection.
Yes. So remaining student centered. So, like I mentioned earlier about social mobility.
Mhm.
And so the idea, I always love asking this question, like, why did you go to school? And everybody's like, oh, I went to school because of this. And my parents encouraged me, or I wanted to make a difference in the world. I wanted to do something different. My siblings, or, I know others in my family that went to school. And the reality is that I've never come across anybody that was like, I just wanted to become Socrates and and think deeply about the work that I'm doing. Like, no, oftentimes it's tied to, either a career pursuit or wanting to do something different or social mobility, right? And so I think it is important for us to remember the student in the heart of our work because they're here for a reason, right? I would love for somebody just to want to get a degree because they want to learn something because they don't know it, right? Like I want to get a degree in philosophy, right? That kind of thing. And shout out to my philosophy majors. But my point is that we know that students are coming to school for a reason, and it's not just about learning. And so I think being sensitive and paying attention to that, I think will help in those conversations around the value of a higher education, right? Especially when you can point to social mobility outcomes. And I think the last one is around it was student centered and then connection, right? You can tell that we're really having a real conversation here.
Yes.
Connection. I mentioned earlier that when students come to an institution, right, you hear them say XYZ school, right? Whether the experience was good or bad, right? They name the whole school. And so I think in terms of relationships, it's important that anytime that you're connecting with a student, they are talking not just about you or your office, but the institution or the college, overall. And I think it is important for us to remember that institutions are its people, right? And you can't get around that, and so when we keep that in mind, we operate in a way that we keep that in the forefront in terms of our interactions and how we work to support people, or how we provide direction, or how we give advice, and how we become cultural navigators, right? So I think it is important for us to keep that in mind as we're doing this work.
Yeah, and everything ties back to being cultural navigators. And as we end this interview, I've been asking a lot of guests about their wellness that they do. So I'm going to ask you, what do you do for your wellness?
For my wellness, for my well-being, my mental and physical well-being. Well, I know that many of your listeners might have known, that there was, some personal things that I was going through, when I made the decision to step down. But I would say that definitely what I've been practicing lately. So I try to walk at least 2 miles a day. I listen to, sermons or podcasts, just really trying to focus on my spiritual wellness at this point, a lot more than I have in the past. And it's made a tremendous impact in terms of, how I see the world. My lenses, right, are being reinformed. And then when I think about definitely spending time with friends, I think sometimes we might just get so caught up in either work or things with our family, right? To spend time around people who love us for who we are is so amazing in the way that I think about, from a heart space perspective, right? To just show up as you are and to be accepted. Everybody wants to be valued. Everybody wants to be accepted and appreciated. So definitely trying to catch up with old friends and just check on people. Like I had one of my friends that said, look, if you're the strong friend, you really need people to check up on you, right? Because you're always the person that's checking up on others. And so I always encourage people, like, reach out and connect with people who you think you haven't heard from in a long time, and it will make a tremendous difference in your day. And the last one I would say in terms of wellness is that I actually went on a low sodium diet and dedicated to increasing my water. Whatever I was drinking, I try to double it for the following week. And my sister's a nurse, and she would always joke me like, people don't drink enough water, but it's true. Like when I started drinking more and more water, like it just made a definite difference in the way that, my skin feels, my sleep quality. Like it's crazy. Like when you're dehydrated, you don't realize how dehydrated you are, right? But then when you become hydrated, you're like, oh, I never want to live that life again. Yeah. So those are some practical things. So I'd say drink water, connect with your friends, definitely move your body, get that blood flowing, get that blood pumping. And I'm not saying that you have to go out and get a gym membership, like just walking around your neighborhood for 15, 20 minutes a day, it really does make a huge difference.
Well, great way to end this. And I look forward to having you on future episodes and get to co-host with me again.
Absolutely, Matt. Thank you for having me. It's just been wonderful being able to have this conversation with you. And I hope the audience is able to, take away some things that are going to make a difference in their practice.